Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. On behalf of the World Value Survey Association and especially the Research Committee 20, Comparative Sociology of the International Sociological Association, I'm delighted to welcome you to our today's session. Today's presentation is entitled Economic Inequality and Unfairness Evaluations of Income Distribution and How They Negatively Predict Social and Political Trust. This presentation addresses a question that is of great importance to both scholars and policymakers. While economic inequality is often discussed in terms of material outcomes, this research highlights its broader implications also for democratic legitimacy, for institutional confidence, and social cohesion. Drawing on more than 2 decades of data from 18 Latin American countries, this study examines how both objective levels of inequality and people's perceptions of fairness shape political and social trust. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Our presenters today are Professor Efrain Garcia Sanchez. He's a fellow at the Department of Social Psychology, my apologies, at the University of Granada, Spain, and research affiliate at Stanford University in the United States. His research focuses on how people perceive, understand, and respond to economic inequality, with particular attention to its consequences for political attitude, democratic governance, and social change. And joining him today is Professor Juan Diego Garcia Castro. Juan is full professor at the University of Costa Rica and researcher at the Institute for Psychological Research. His work explores the social psychology of economic inequality, distributive justice, ideology, violence, and political and social attitudes in Central America and Latin America. We are very grateful to both Efrain and Juan Diego for joining us today and for sharing their research with the members and followers of ISA RC20 and the World Value Survey community. Following the presentation, we will open the floor for questions and discussion, but you are welcome to use chat to post your questions and remarks throughout the webinar, and we will address as many as possible during the Q&A. With this, it is my great pleasure to hand over the floor to Efrain and Juan Diego. Welcome, and thank you both for being with us today.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this set of seminars organized by International Sociological Association. And yeah, so I would like to just to introduce the topic before we get into the details of this study, in the spirit of having a conversation, just rather than a lecture. It's more about sharing some findings, some reflections we have been working on over the last years in this, what we say, this emerging area of the social psychology of economic inequality. So thank you very much also for not only for inviting us, but also for embracing this multidisciplinary approach. We believe, even though we are psychologists working in social psychology, we truly believe that we need to address problems from a very holistic and multidisciplinary approach, and also taking into account different levels. Sometimes we get into these disciplinary battles about whether it is the structure or whether that is in the individual. And we believe that we need to understand them both simultaneously. So that's the spirit of this talk. We believe that this is the right way to go in this area. So let me start in this case just by giving you some context about economic inequality in the public debate, because this is like the starting point that we had when we started working on this topic. And as you know, there are some milestones, landmarks over the last years that put economic inequality in the public debate. So for example, in this book, so Thomas Piketty, he just showed this U-shaped curve back in 2013, I believe, in which he showed empirically how the top decile income share right now, at least approximately, is similar to that level of a century ago. So he was just basically showing empirically for the first time this huge concentration of income and wealth in from a historical perspective. And this created a lot of discussion, a lot of debate. But this was paired almost simultaneously with some years of difference, this book, written by Richard Wilkinson and Piquet. And what they showed was this positive correlation, association between the extent of income inequality and some health and social problems that they put together into an index. This work, of course, this work has been challenged. People have contested this idea because of some methodological issues. But beyond that, the accuracy of this claim, this created a lot of debate. This idea that economic inequality is empirically affecting the well-being of individuals and societies. So that was another landmark in the discussion of economic inequality in the public debate. They even showed that same idea 15 years later. So this was a more recent report they published, and they showed basically the same idea. As I mentioned, this idea has been contested, has been challenged, but as an idea, we believe this was a powerful idea directing a public debate on the role of economic inequality on individuals and societal outcomes. But in addition, there was a third landmark, which was after the economic crisis in 2008. We saw this explosion of social movements and social unrest all around the world. So maybe one of the most famous movement was the Occupy Wall Street movement. This was impressive. People moved, so people protested. They engaged in a lot of collective actions denouncing this extreme wealth concentration that was also affecting political power concentration. Some less known movements that even preceded Occupy Wall Street, but of course it was not in the United States, so that was not as well known as the previous one, but was the movement of the indignados. Los indignados were people that were outraged by this, but how the government handled the economic crisis. They were denouncing extreme economic inequalities, corruption, and in that movement, they gave birth to new political parties that went into power recently in Spain. So that was like a huge landmark in the historical perspective. And more historically, we have seen over the last years in Latin America several estallidos sociales. So estallidos sociales is like social, like a bomb. So something exploded. And by those estallidos sociales, people basically they protested against some unfair laws or policies that were trying to change the current state of affairs. This is a picture of my city in Cali, in Colombia, where people they call this place Puerto Resistencia, like the port of resistance. That was a common place in which people go to have some street food, and they just occupy the space, and they created a lot of art and demonstrations to show that they needed to have this sense of to resisting some unfair policies. Particularly in this case, in Colombia, was about a very aggressive and regressive tax reform, with a lot of tax cuts for the wealthiest and a lot of the burden being imposed on the bottom of the society. So having said that, this is about the public discussion on this. But so now, how social psychology engaged within this discussion, and just basically trying to communicate a very basic idea that, for example, this um, Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset mentioned in his book, and he said this famous quote that I am I and my circumstance, and if I do not save it, my circumstance, I do not save myself. And this is the philosophy that we, from a social psychological perspective, want to embrace. For example, this idea was simplified by Kurt Lewin, which one of the founding fathers of social psychology, and he claimed that to understand behavior, we need to understand it as an interaction, as a function of a person in the environment. Of course, in our case, the environment we want to study is economic inequality. is how economic inequality is creating a condition that shapes how people think, feel, and behave. And with this perspective, we have some experience with this within in this area, in which some people from a sociological perspective have been studying, trying to theorize on this social psychology of inequality, in which they most of the time has tried to map what is the effect of inequality on our psychology. So it's how this unequal context is affecting people's individual outcomes. But more recently, we have had this discussion, this more vivid discussion right now, from a social psychological perspective, how how we can extend this approach from the structure to the individual to see all this interplay between structures and individual through different levels. So from this social psychological perspective, I just want to contextualize this, which is what we call the social psychology of economic inequality, which of course conceptualize what is the effect of economic inequality specifically on individual and societal outcomes, for example, on individuals and societal well-being, on political attitudes toward democracy, authoritarianism, and so forth. But by extending that, we mean that we also need to understand when, for whom, or under what circumstances inequality shapes our psychology. So we don't have an homogeneous effect, but we also have a lot of heterogeneity here. And also, we believe that we need to account for how, why, and through which social psychological mechanisms inequality is having an impacts our psychology. For example, in our research, we have found how, for example, economic inequality increases status anxiety, the sense of competition, which in turn affects your well-being, influence how you make judgments about society or other groups. But maybe in our most recent work, we also try to do some kind of back engineering in which we think that the social psychology of economic inequality also need to account for how we can use psychological insights in order to challenge inequality. This might be very ambitious, of course, it is ambitious, but how people perceive inequality, understand it, how this psychological knowledge that we know about how people think, feel, and behave can also be used to create some interventions so people can make decisions that are more aligned to public policies or collective actions that hopefully can reduce inequality. So we believe this is like the social psychology of economic inequalities trying to work at different levels simultaneously. So this is the background from which we are coming from, just to give you some context. Now, why study economic inequality in Latin America? So, Juan Diego.
So hi, all. Thank you for the audience to be in this presentation, and good morning from Costa Rica, where I am based. So I'm going to tell you about two specific things about this presentation. The first, why we think it's important to study inequality and to do research in inequality in Latin America, and also a little bit of a theoretical background about. Okay, so first, this is a Latin America map. You know, Latin America is a big region in the world, and then we can pass this one. Efrain. Okay, first we have a personal bias of why studying inequality in Latin America, because I am from Costa Rica. This is this tiny country here in red, and also Efrain is from Colombia. This a bigger country down there. Okay, first we have a personal bias, of course, and then second, Latin America is one of the most unequal regions in the world. In this chart, Latin America have the largest gap between the bottom 50 percent of the population, of the income population, from the top 10%. So this gap here is one of the largest in the world. So it's a really extreme inequality in the region. And then third, as Ephraim said in the beginning, we have a lot of fights again for social justice. For example, we can see the case of Bolivia at the moment. but also in different countries. Cuba, a few months ago, Venezuela, Peru. We're always fighting for social justice. So we have extreme inequality in one hand, but also a lot of social unrest and social movement seeking for justice in the area. And also, for we can continue with the slide. Latin America is underrepresented in science, and in psychology, we come from a replication crisis. And one of the reasons why we think we have this replication crisis is because most of the studies about in science in general come from the global north. So it's also that this is why it's also important to study inequality in the region. Okay, and some historical background about perceptions and evaluation of economic inequality. We have been studying how unfairness evaluation have effects on the region. We are going to show you some data about description over time, and in this case, about the association between social and political trust. First, we have to say, and this is important, that evaluate inequality is different than perceive inequality. And this differentiation is important because most of the time, or sometimes, it gets mixed in the literature. People first have to perceive inequality, and then when what people perceive, people have to evaluate how fair or unfair this inequality is. And this process the evaluation is kind of like a second step process in people's minds. And this evaluation has some influence about first the context and then the ideology that people hold. In these ideologies, we can say meritocratic belief is one of the strongest ideology associated with inequality, but also system justification, social dominance, and so on. Okay, we can move on. And then we propose in our theoretical background or a theoretical proposal is in this path between objective inequality and perceived economic inequality. This, let's say, like subjective inequality is the translation of how objective inequality have effects on people's behavior. But in this part, social segregation, economic inequality, and ideologies that justify inequality have an influence about how people perceive and how people relate with the structural inequality. But then, how the perception and evaluation of inequality influence outcomes, and this example here is subjective well-being, but we can say also political and social trust. We have some psychosocial mechanisms that influence this path. And the most important ones is social distance, that we can say is the distance between, let's say, people who have more money than the people who have less money. This social distance that make people not see the circumstances and how other people experience social life, and also a status competition, because when a society is unequal, the place that people have in society is more important than in more egalitarian societies. So the status that people have in let's say more unequal societies, like we say the status competition, is another psychosocial mechanism that explain the relation between perceive and evaluate inequality and outcomes. And again, ideology that plays a very important role in this area of study. We have been doing this line of research in the region for some years already. We have been studying different areas of the different outcomes, the different behaviors, different impacts that fairness evaluation have people's behavior in the region. And when we see how people evaluate inequality, for example, over time, we can see this graph on the left from 97 to the last data point that we have from 224. And we can see some ups and downs, but in general, people evaluate inequality as unfair in the region over time. We have detailed this by country, and we can see more that closer ups and downs, how progressive governments or right-wing governments changes evaluations. But in general, we can say that people in Latin America evaluate inequality as unfair over time. So as I said, we have been studying this for a while, and we have been trying to focus of what happens when people evaluate these inequalities unfair and which outcomes we can find with the data that we have. And now, in this case, we're going to talk about the effects on political and social trust.
Yeah, so thank you, Juan, for that background. So right now, I'm going to describe the details of the research we wanted to share with you today. This theoretical background is very important because what we are trying to communicate is that in order to understand the consequences or the effects of inequality on individual outcomes, we also need to account for psychological mechanisms through which that inequality can reach individuals and societies at the end. And we were inspired by this paper. In this paper, the authors argue that um, the negative association between inequality and social and political trust is not because of inequality in itself, but it's because of social class. And there's uh, a lot of evidence showing that social class is key to understand both political and social trust. So we were puzzled by that because of course, they use an impressive amount of data, World Value Survey, some other survey from the I think was from Korea, and they make this strong claim. And we were puzzled, and we wanted to extend and qualify that idea because in our understanding, at least in our context, we have seen and we have studied as well these pernicious effects of economic inequality. So we wanted to extend that research and qualify it in one specific context, which is Latin America. So we decided to go for the highest quality data we can get access to. In this case was the Latino Barometro, in which we were able to put together data from 18 countries across 13 waves. So we can have like this a three-level structure of the data. So we can have data to compare differences between countries and also to evaluate whether fluctuations within countries over time has an effect on that. And also we can analyze the within country wave patterns of results. So we wanted to zoom in on Latin America to see whether this was true also in that specific region. As the previous data, they compiled a very heterogeneous data set, which is great, but at the same time, it can also miss some nuances. But also, what Juan Diego just mentioned, which is we also believe that we needed to account for subjective views of economic inequality. So you don't have like a straightforward effect, but you also need to process it, to perceive it, to understand it, to justify it. And that's why we believe that we wanted to demonstrate that this psychological component is also important. There are many details, methodological details. I'm going to skip those. You can also read the paper by yourselves, just to communicate the main findings. So the first finding, and I know that you are interested in comparative sociology, we saw that, for example, political distrust uh, show some consensus. For example, on the left plot, you can see we created a composite score of trust in Congress, political parties, and the judiciary. We created like a mean score, and on average, people place themselves around number two, which means they distrust political institutions, and that was very consistent across all countries. except with an exception for Uruguay, which is one of the most egalitarian countries in the region. But more or less, they're very much close to each other. But when you see social trust, in this case, this is the percentage of people that say that most people can be trusted. We found more heterogeneous differences between countries in Latin America, but it's still, most of them are scoring about 19% of the people are mentioning that most people can be trusted, which means that one-fifth of the population trusts that others, believe that others are trustworthy. To give you some context about this finding, you can see, for example, this is stark contrast between Latin America and Europe. For example, in Europe, you can see here how about 36 to 37% of the population trusts the parliament or the government, and about half of the population trusts the European Union. So you can see this stark contrast related to political trust. And for social trust, the gap is even larger. For example, in this case, in the United States or in Canada, 71% of people in Canada say that most people can be trusted, compared to the United States, which is about 58%, Denmark, and so forth. So the country with the highest social distrust is two times more trustworthy, trust two times more than people in Latin America. So here we're dealing with a very unique context with a highly levels of political distrust, political and social distrust. Second finding is that, as you might have expected, political and social distrust have declined over time, both political trust and social trust. So this is the fixed effect of time. So every time that passes, there is like a reduction in both political trust and social trust. Third finding is that when we evaluate the fluctuations in economic inequality within country over time, we found that when country increase the levels of economic inequality, the levels of political trust and social trust decreases. This is important because we separated the differences between countries from the fluctuations within countries over time. So here we are accounting for this variation, fluctuation within country. So indeed, we found that in Latin America, when countries increases their inequality levels, it also decreases their political and social trust. A fourth finding is about differences between countries. And in this case, we've found a similar pattern, which is that the most unequal countries, on average, they reported the lower levels of social trust. However, this result was not statistically significant by regular standards for political trust, even though the patterns goes in the same direction. One thing to explain this is, of course, as I mentioned before, we have a low variability between countries. We are maybe dealing with some kind of flu effect in this case, but still, this finding is suggestive that there should be something going on here to pay attention to. And the fifth and final finding that I want to highlight in this talk is that we also found that on unfairness evaluations of economic inequality, this should be negatively predict political and social trust. In this case, for example, we found that when we included unfairness evaluations, unfairness evaluations mediated the effect of economic inequality on social and political trust. Let me unpack this in this way, which may be more illustrative. What we found is that objective levels of economic inequality, so when countries increases their inequality over time, it also increases the sense of unfairness regarding the income distribution, which is expected. And then these unfairness evaluations of economic inequality reduces or was negatively associated with political trust and with social trust. If we see together this, we found that it was these unfairness evaluations of economic inequality, one of the potential mechanisms, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that can be influencing or explaining why economic inequality is having this eroding effect on political and social trust. So to conclude, This piece of research and this talk is basically to communicate that from our perspective, taking into account this social psychological approach, we believe that we need to understand this interplay between structural and psychological factors in how people think, feel, and behave. And particularly, here we're thinking of how perceptions and evaluations of economic inequality are powerful mechanisms actually that are being exploited for some people in order to influence on attitudes toward democracy, attitudes toward, for example, authoritarian leaders, and so forth. The second thing is that we believe that we also need to ask more questions, maybe the right questions, because sometimes we are at this stage right now in which we don't see average effects of inequality of many outcomes. So you can see, for example, there is a lot of mixed evidence that economic inequality is not associated with well-being. We don't have a meta-analytic evidence testing, for example, the effects of inequality on other outcomes. But maybe the question here isn't about whether there is an effect, but maybe when or for whom we have an effect. And that's why we believe we need to qualify this research by introducing more contextualized analysis, in this case in Latin America, but also about specific mechanisms. Another thing is about Latin America. We believe, of course, we are deeply concerned and interested in studying Latin America because of personal reasons. But of course, we believe that we need and we should learn more about Latin America to enrich the scientific debate. On the one hand, we have, of course, highly unequal context, but at the same time, we can see in Latin America as a natural experiment. And we can see different levels of distrust, social unrest, and social movements. And actually, this is interesting because most of the time we think of Latin America as through the social unrest or instability, but at the same time, there is a lot of social movements trying to redress that inequality, which is like a constant search. And finally, we believe that we need to find bridges between economic inequality and other types of inequality. For example, political inequality, inequality in access to health and educational services. And I believe that these kind of elements can be tracked very well in Latin America. So we can see potential future scenarios and identify how inequality creates this vicious cycle that perpetuates itself. And maybe, hopefully, this is our hope, we can learn more about how people process that information so they can engage in decision making, in social movements, collective actions, or even by casting their ballots when they make decisions in terms of public policies or politicians. So we believe that enriching this understanding of how people think, feel, and behave on inequality would be like a future and potential benefit for work. So this is basically what we wanted to share with you today, where we are coming from, what we have done so far. There are many details that we omitted, but we are very happy to talk more about whatever you want. So, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Efrain and Juan Diego. Much appreciated. Very interesting presentation, and thank you very much for bringing in the background information as well. So the floor is now open for questions, comments, remarks, suggestions. I see colleagues from Latin America in the audience. I see also colleagues who work on trust matters. So hopefully there will be a lot of feedback for you. So if you would like to speak up, please raise your hand, and then you can unmute yourself and share your question or comment. Or if you cannot speak aloud, you can use the chat function to post the questions in chat. And while everyone is thinking, I wanted to ask you briefly about your operationalization of political trust. I believe you used three variables, right? It was trust in the justice system, in the Congress, and the political parties, right?
Right.
Yeah. Was there any rationale behind this selection, or were the variables for the longest time series? I'm asking because at least in the European context, trust in political parties is usually, first of all, the lowest among all political institutions. And secondly, there are sometimes a bit of unclarity about so which party the respondents actually have in mind when they answer this question. Because if I'm supporting party A, then I might be trusting my party, but not other parties. And here it is more collective parties. So this item behaves slightly different, maybe from other political institutions to which we measure confidence.
Hmm. Juan, do you want to say something? Or
Well, yeah, just go ahead. I mean, I can follow you. I mean, it's a nice question. I think uh, it's a limitation, of course, and there's a limitation that we have to deal with when we work with secondary data. That we have to make an index of the measure that we have in order to take into account the more variability as possible. But yeah, I mean, that's a great point.
yeah. So one point is about that. So it was the availability of the information, but also was also a theoretical decision because it there are some other. So for example, one thing empirically, those three items were highly correlated. So even though there might be differences and nuances, they are highly correlated, and to some extent, there were no differences, substantive differences between them. On the other hand, the Congress and the judiciary, they're allegedly less politicized. Allegedly, because we know that that's not the case. But for example, in that case, they work independently of the parties in place. But this is like something under question right now in many countries, and especially in Latin America. And the political parties, you're totally right. It's Nia, totally right. This is a limitation, but at the same time, it was about I think we right now have this crisis of institutional credibility. So that would be an excellent point to go in the future, which is about differentiating between institutions. We didn't do that because we didn't find differences. So we decided to put them together. But that would be an interesting point to do right now under current situations. But great point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have now a question from Andrew Dawson. Andrew, you're welcome.
Yes, thank you so much. So thank you both for the talk. Very interesting. Really enjoyed the presentation. So a quick question, just to understand your operationalization, and then kind of a larger question. So the short question is, for the evaluations of fairness, how did you operationalize that?
Oh, yeah.
And my understanding, I haven't had a chance to read the paper, but I think the talk you gave today is based on the paper you guys have published, I think a year or two ago. So
It
I
is.
look forward to reading that. So that information is probably there, but it does pertain to this broader question that, because I've been thinking a lot on this idea of how economic inequality could affect well-being overall, and particularly I work in the fields of political trust and social trust. So how that affects it. So from what I understand of the argument is you're suggesting that if you just look at what we could call kind of objective inequality, or sort of inequality that's objectively measurable, that doesn't really have a strong direct effect, or not at all in terms of statistical significance for political trust, a little bit for social trust. But really, if you put in these fairness evaluations, this is where you get the more significant effects. So it goes objective inequality, which influences these evaluations of redistributive fairness, which then influences political and social trust. And that makes a lot of sense to me. My question is, what I've been thinking about is this relationship between objective and economic inequality and then perceived economic inequality, right? So of course, economic inequality could go up, and social scientists and so on might be very attuned to changes in economic inequality. But also, sometimes it's not related to how people perceive, how equal or unequal their society is, right? So I'm wondering whether this, you think the fairness evaluations, however it's operationalized, if that might capture it, or is it even possible that there's another sort of link in here, which is objective inequality, which may or may not influence subjective inequality, but it's really perceptions of inequality, then looking at fairness, then looking at effects on well-being and social and political trust as measures. So I'm not sure. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud right now. I'm not sure I'm convinced that that's really the case, but I wanted to get your views, particularly on this idea of perceived inequality and how that can be different from objective inequality and how that might influence findings.
Yeah, those are great points. And so let me just go. Juan, please jump in whenever you want. So regarding the way to operationalize unfairness evaluations, we rely on this item. This is a very standard item. This is not great because this is just like a one item for options in the scale. So I think we are dealing with a huge limitation because subjective inequality includes both. Includes on the one hand how much inequality people perceive, so about a more descriptive idea, and how much inequality they are willing to tolerate or to believe that this is justified, which is like a more evaluative component. We believe that those components are related, but those components maps different psychological processes because you can perceive a large inequality and it's still justified because, as someone just mentioned in the chat, you can believe that inequality is the outcome of your merit. So that's totally fine. So regarding this is the item. How fair do you think is the distribution of income inequality, of income in your country from this scale? Now, you raised a key point, and let me show you a plot that we have here, because a wave in Latin barometer in which they asked participants to estimate the percentage of income owned by each, I think it was by quintiles. So the 20% at the bottom, the 20% next to that, and so forth. So they needed to assign the percentage of income captured by each quintile. And based on that estimates, perceptions, or misperceptions, we computed pseudo Gini index. So with that distribution of income, we can compute some kind of Gini index, and we found something like this, in which, in this case, is the diamonds, the blue diamonds, are the pseudo Gini index based on these estimates of the income captured by each quintile, and the blue dots, and the orange diamonds is the objective economic inequality. As you can see here, there is no association between those two. So people are perceiving totally different realities. And we were a little bit naive at the beginning because we believed that we only needed to make people more aware of inequality. So I just need you to give you the right information and give you the right data. We have found in our research that that's not the case. That's why we go the other route, which is about unfairness evaluations. So it's not only about if you perceive a lot of inequality or less inequality, that might be part of the equation at the beginning. Actually, when you perceive more inequality, you are more likely to evaluate it as more unfair, but that's not always the case. That's the case of the moderators by ideology. So that's why we decided to go for unfairness. And I believe that unfairness evaluation is such an important point because it captures this sense of certainty on the system, that you can rely on that system that protects you. Unfairness evaluations, as well as political trust, can be components of this overarching concept, which is social cohesion. So when actually in psychology, we have this variable, which is the belief, world, just world beliefs. And when you believe that the world is just or is fair, you report more well-being. So something similar, a similar framework applied to this is when you believe that the world is more fair, you will be more likely to trust in your institution because there is something else that is protecting you. So my point on your comment, sorry for this round, is that evaluation is more sensitive to changes in objective economic inequality. And that's why we believe that is this more evaluative component rather than the descriptive one that shows more shows more impact on mobilizing people to support political agendas to redress inequality. So I would say that that's my sorry, Andrew. It's like a reflection together. So thank you for the comment. One.
No, I just want to make a small point. I mean, we have found that it is a very weak relation between objective inequality and perception of inequality because people in their daily life don't know, for example, how much money the rich people have and so on. But in this graph that Efrain is showing here, also make another point of the presentation is the gap between objective and perceived inequality is not the same in every country. You know, there are some countries that the gap is bigger, and then some other countries the gap is smaller. So this gap it depends of also of the context. That's why we focus on in which scenarios economic inequality, objective and subjective economic inequality have an influence on different outcomes. You know, it's kind of like not like a general effect around the world. You know, like it's specifically in some places and in others not. And the other point is like how we don't find this close relationship between objective and subjective inequality. That's why also I mean, we're social psychologists. That's why we focus on the evaluations and perception of inequality because that's will have an effect. You know what we have found that have an effect on outcomes and behavior than objective inequality.
Thank you very much. So we still have some time for a few questions. If you would like to speak up, please raise your hand.
Also, I can say something about the chat. I mean, I don't know about which article are referring in the chat, but of course we are willing to share. And you know about how we measure perceptions of inequality or evaluation. Let's say we have the field as kind of new. Let's say we have like around 25 years. I mean, not us, but the field doing research and social psychology of economic inequality. So we have developed different measures, but it's not a consent about how to measure perception of inequality. And each measure found different effects. And that's a problem in the field. You know, measuring problems in social psychology is a big issue. As you know, at the moment, measures focusing on people experience in everyday life, but also graph measures about showing people graph of societies of how unequal the distribution of income and wealth are in societies are the ones that found the strongest effects at the moment. You know, but there's a lot of noise and a lot of measuring errors when we measure perception of inequality. Specifically, perception of inequality, not evaluation, because evaluation is a more complex. People really have to think how unfair inequality is. So those measures are not as bad as perceptions measure that we have more error on those measures.
Yes, Marita, please go ahead.
Yes, good. Thank you for the presentation. I think it was really very interesting. Coming from Latin America, I agree totally that it's a region where we can especially make a profound analysis on this because we have big issues with this theme. So thank you for that. And thinking about political trust, when you take political parties, which is okay, parliament also, and judiciary. And the comparison with the European, with the Eurobarometer, is very good because it shows how low trust is in a region. But from what I remember of the data, one of the main things has to do with the judiciary, which has a lot to do with fairness also. So it would be nice to see if we only took judiciary, what would happen. Because, say, one of the big differences with European countries, for example, is that trust in justice is much higher in those countries. Where we are really weaker is in the judiciary system, which in many democracies is what is sustaining a lot the system.
Sorry, Marita. So you say that the trust in the judiciary specifically would be lower. Is that what yours, or the
Yeah,
contrary?
yes.
I need to double check that data. I thought the opposite.
No, well,
But
it's an hypothesis. So I thought it was interesting to have a look at that, looking at what you presented.
yeah, yeah, thank you for that suggestion. Yeah, absolutely. So each institution has its own particularities. Actually, we included at the beginning the police and the military, and reviewers requested us to remove them just because they might be bringing more noise. And we have all these clashes with the police all the time, so this might um, uh, yeah, it bring more noise.
Yeah,
But definitely, I think a step forward, and I received that feedback as a call to
okay,
continue
thank you.
deepening to see those differences. Yeah. So thank you, Marita, for that comment.
Thank
It's a
you.
great point. Like right now in Costa Rica, what is holding the system, we have a right-wing party in government right now, and the judicial system is the one that is holding democracy, right? Uh,
Mhm.
so it's a great point to take up for the future. Yeah, we have to look closer to that. So
Yeah.
Thank you very
Especially right
much.
now. So, sorry, just one brief comment, which is, so we have elections in Colombia this weekend. Terrible results. Because right now we have this tendency of people, the strong leaders, claiming that they own the solutions, and the solutions are basically to shape all the institutions for their own benefit. So we have in Argentina, we have El León, the lion in Milei, no? And we have in Colombia, they selected the tiger. He calls himself the tiger. And in Costa Rica, when it told me that they have a jaguar. So we have a lot of felines with a lot of meaning dominating the the political landscape right now. And I believe that they are just exploiting all these political distrust to show themselves as outsiders, and they are using the institutions then to erode the same institutions so they can perpetuate themselves. So this is like a critical thinking, a contextual note about what you mentioned about how we need to continue deepening on this because some important changes are just happening right now. So this may change importantly when you think about the role of the judiciary and the Congress, because this might change after these new governments. Great point.
Thank you very much, Efrain and Juan Diego. I don't see any more hands, and I think we have answered all questions. Some colleagues were asking if they can contact you by email. I hope you agree.
Of course, of course.
Quality is an important topic, and its relevance goes well beyond the Latin American continent. Same like social and political trust. So I hope you receive more feedback and maybe opportunities for collaboration on this topic with the colleagues from the audience. Thank you very much for excellent presentation. It has been very interesting and a great pleasure to learn about your research and very interesting findings. Many thanks for everyone who joined us today. We're reaching the end of the hour, so we will be closing the session now. The recording of the webinar will be available online, so if you joined a bit later, you can watch it from tomorrow onwards. And before we switch off, the floor for the last word to Efrain and Juan Diego.
Thank you for the invitation and to be here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And please keep in mind that we are very open to extend this collaboration network. So I believe this is like a great opportunity to present in this, a sociological association this work from social psychology. So I think I see a lot of potential so we can collaborate. So please feel free to reach out. We will be very much happy to do some extra exchanging. So thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye. You too.